This morning I want us to talk about the subject of faithfulness. We read the passage earlier, and Paul was an interesting Christian. And I think if anybody got it right, it was probably Paul. There are a lot of biblical characters that we could say that about, but Paul for sure, if anybody got it right, it would have been him. Well, as we look at this, I want us to break it down into two categories. Let's talk about being a servant, and let's talk about being a steward. While they sound like they're the same, I think one is bigger than the other and a part of being the other. So I think as we look at this, you'll see what I'm talking about. But let's look at this. And in this passage, when we look at being a servant and a steward, what Paul is basically saying and beginning this chapter with is that we must be faithful. We must prove to be faithful. I loved the final words of that song we just sang about how we will be true till death. We will be faithful till death. Now that's a noble proclamation. We all sang it, but do we mean it? And so this passage wants us to get to the place where we can mean what we just sang. So that's how we can tie this all together. And as we look at this, we must prove faithful in two areas: service and responsibility. Well, let's look at this together. First of all, service and responsibility found in verse 1. It says here, "So then men ought to regard us as servants of Christ." Now, the word translated servant here comes from a Greek word which literally means one who is an under-rower. Do you know what an under-rower is? An under-rower was a slave that was in the galleys of the ship that made the ship go. They never saw daylight. They never got to see where the ship was going. They just rowed. They made the ship go. Those servants, those under-rowers, made the ship go because they were faithful in their part. Paul talks about the body and how each part of the body works together so that the body does what it was intended to do. You can't ask a hand to do what the ear does. The hand can't hear. The ear can't grab things. Though I'm sure if you look long enough on TikTok, you can probably find somebody doing something with their ear. But for the most part, the body has parts, and we have to serve as those parts. And here, he's talking about those slaves that were in the belly of the ship that made the ship go. When we look at our lives, do we see a person who is willing to do whatever it takes for the cause of Christ? So what exactly does it mean to be saved? I mean, think about it really for a second. What does it mean to be saved? What did you do when you became saved, and what did it mean? What was different from the day you weren't saved to the day you were saved? What's the difference? Is there a difference? There should be. The way you acted before you were saved should be completely different than the way after you're saved. Now, there are a lot of nice people in this world, and when they become saved, a lot of times it translates right into being a good Christian as well. But I'm talking about what changes in your life. You say, "I'm saved," but what does that mean? What you're basically saying is, "Well, I'm going to heaven." That's what you mean by that. That's what most people mean when they say, "I'm saved." But what does it mean to be saved? Are you supposed to be doing anything because you're saved? Or did you walk the aisle, grab the preacher by the hand, say a magical prayer, and now you're saved? And so you live your life the way you always did. You're a good person. But are you fulfilling your purpose as a servant? You see, a person who is loyal to Christ in all phases of their life spend time and prayer and talents for the use of praising God and building the kingdom. Jesus said, if any man would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. There's a pattern there. When you accept Christ, you're not just saying, hey, I want to go to heaven. You're saying, I want to follow Christ. I want to do what Christ does. I want to be actively doing what Christ does. So all you have to do, open your eyes, look around, and see what God is doing. And God will show you what you should be doing. Unless you close your eyes, which I think is what happens to a lot of Christians today. They get the salvation certificate, and then they close their eyes. This is truly a challenge that every Christian needs to hear. This is where the water meets the wheel. We must be found faithful. We must prove ourselves faithful. We are slaves of God our Master, and we are in the galley of the ship, and we are told to row. And the question is, are we faithful in rowing? The next part of this verse, the King James gets it right. I want you to pay attention to this one for me, Blake. I'm going to read the NIV, and then I'm going to ask you to tell us what the difference was. And you probably can already figure it out from what we're talking about. But it says in the NIV, and as those entrusted with the secret things of God. So let's put this in context. It says, so then men ought to regard us as servants of Christ, number one. And number two, and as those entrusted with the secret things of God. What does the King James call that individual?
A steward.
A steward. So we talked about being a servant and being a steward and how they come together. Well, the King James actually translates it better because a steward summarizes what I'm really trying to say. A servant indicates the idea of service, but a steward indicates a grander responsibility. I gave it away. A grander responsibility. To be a steward means you are taking on responsibility. Now, can anybody think of an example in the Bible of a person who was a steward? Now, there are parables told about stewards. We'll get to that in a minute. But the best example that I can think of just off, while we're talking about it, is that of Joseph. You remember Joseph had this dream. His brothers hated him for that dream. They threw him in a pit. They sold him to the Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites took him off to Egypt, and he became the right-hand man, if you will, to a man by the name of Potiphar. And remember, Potiphar's wife had the hots for Joseph, and that all shenanigans went on. But Joseph, as Genesis 39 teaches us, was put in charge of Potiphar's entire house. Do you know why? Or do you remember why? Because everything that Joseph was a part of, God blessed. Potiphar realized this and said, well, I want this guy in charge. Now, what did Joseph own? He didn't own anything. In fact, he was owned by Potiphar. He was a slave. But more than that, because Potiphar had other slaves, Joseph was put in charge of his household. He became a steward. He was in charge of his entire estate. He controlled the business affairs, he issued supplies, and he made decisions. But he did not own anything. Sound familiar? You see, God gives us greatness in this life if we pursue it. But we have to make it consistent with our responsibilities to everyone else around us. Did you know all of you have a responsibility for yourself? You realize that, right? But as a Christian, you have a responsibility first to other Christians and then to non-Christians. The Bible makes this very clear. That's the kind of responsibility that we possess as Christians, just like Joseph. He was a steward of what God or what Potiphar gave him to control. So we are stewards of what God gives us to control. Then we look at verse 2 of our passage, and this is the passage where it basically pulls it together, and it says, we must prove faithful. It's not optional. It's not something that you get to decide. You see, you got to decide if you wanted to be a Christian, but you do not get to decide if you're faithful. Try being a Christian and not being faithful and see what happens. How many of you were ever taken out behind the woodshed? Okay, I can remember a time or two. I'd classify it as a woodshed even though it might have been a metal shed and had a lawnmower in it. But we must prove faithful. Listen to verse 2. Now it is required, what's that mean? It's required, that those who have been given a trust, that's a steward, must prove faithful. I'm curious, I think the King James says be found.
Yeah, it says, moreover, it is required in stewards that a man be found faithful.
Okay, so the NIV translates it, we must prove ourselves faithful. Well, what does that mean? What's proving something mean? Have you ever been to a court of law? And they prove the guilt, they prove the innocence, whatever it is, but that's what they work on, proving it. Well, as Christians, we are to prove ourselves faithful, or as the King James says, prove or be found faithful. So when God looks at us, does He find us faithful? It is required, it is sought for. Thus, faithfulness is sought after by a servant, and a true servant finds it. As Christians, we are told that if we truly seek, we will find. A literal translation of this verse would be, now faithfulness is to be sought after by the Christian, and it must be found. The idea behind the statement is that of a courtroom scene, and as Christians, we stand before the judge, and we must prove to be faithful in everything He asks us to do. But are we? Maybe. It really is as simple as seeing someone in need and meeting that need. We'll get to that more here in just a minute. Almost got ahead of myself. Well, we can know, or how can we know, that we've been found faithful? You know, because we live our lives, we try to be faithful, sometimes we fail, sometimes we succeed, and sometimes we learn more from the failures to make us more successful later. Okay, that's part of life. But how can we know this? How can we know? Well, Paul goes on in verses 3 through 5 and breaks down 3 kinds of judgment. There's 3 kinds of judgment that Christians face, but only the final judgment is the one we should be concerned with. Listen to how Paul says it. First, he says in verse 3, he says, I care very little if I am judged by you or by any human court. What's he basically saying? He doesn't care what you have to think. And sometimes you have to live your life not caring what the world thinks. Paul didn't. He didn't care what anybody else said about him. He just made every day as faithful as he could be. And if somebody looked at him and didn't think he was faithful, remember there was an argument about Paul or Apollos and who to follow. Paul said, Don't drag me into this. We follow Christ. So don't pull me into that vicious game. So if you want to judge me, Paul says, I don't care. I don't give a hoot. Because it really doesn't matter. What someone else says does not matter. It doesn't really matter what the world's opinion of your faithfulness is. Paul didn't get upset when people criticized him. Do you know why? Because he knew that it really didn't matter. However, many of us today put too much emphasis on what other people think. And it changes our behavior. It changes our actions. We spend so many hours trying to impress others that we forget that it is God that we are supposed to impress. Paul says, I care very little. Let me translate that. I don't care. I care very little if I am judged by you, he's talking to the church, or by any other human court. But he wanted to be found faithful. So, the first type of judgment that we face is the judgment of others, what they see us, and that one doesn't really matter. The next one, listen to this, is the second part of verse 3. Indeed, I don't even judge myself. And guess what? He tells us why. Why should we not judge ourselves? Without looking back at the passage, try to figure it out. Why should we not judge ourselves? Let me tell you in the most easy Arkansas vernacular that I know how. You can't trust your own judgment because your own judgment is as wrong or worse than someone else's judgment. I would venture to say that 99% of the people in this room today think everything is hunky-dory in their Christian life. But maybe we need to examine that. I've been going through this spiritual thing for about 2 to 3 months. I have not told anybody this. You're the first to know. I've just been going through this thing, and what I am learning is just how far removed I am from being where I need to be. And it's manifested itself in such a way that I have been challenged more so than I've ever been challenged in my entire life. As a part of this, I've been reading the Bible through. That has really challenged me. Not that it's hard to do, but the amazing amount of information I'm taking in from reading the Bible through. The last time I did it, I was a teenager. You know, I've read passages multiple times. I've probably read the entire Bible multiple times, but to read it through in a chronological order gives you a different perspective. And it has greatly challenged me. So this past week, and I'm telling you something I probably shouldn't be telling you, but I'm going to tell you anyway. This past week, as I was going to bed, doing my prayer time, I began to pray, and the Lord was convicting me about some of the things that I'm working through, and I finally just threw my hands in the air and said, okay, I give up. I won't get into any more details than that. I'm just going to tell you that's the way I said it. So I'm thinking to myself, the results are going to be a certain something. I thought, okay, God, I'll do it, but I am going to fail. But guess what? The next day, He solved the problem. He gave me exactly what I needed to not fail. I was more impressed this week. Now, this was a terrible week for me in a lot of ways. But that event that took place may have been more monumental than my salvation experience itself. Because maybe at that moment, maybe for the first time in my entire Christian life, I finally realized I'm not where I need to be. That's the challenge we all must face if we're going to prove to be faithful. I care very little if I am judged by you, and I certainly don't trust my own judgment. Paul says, my conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. He's basically saying he cannot trust his own judgment of himself, because if I'm going to judge myself, everything's great. I'll be first in line walking in the pearly gates. Self-judgment can be distorted. Sometimes we think more highly of ourselves than we ought. You may be sitting smug in your pew this morning, thinking, hey, Brother Mike, that's a great testimony. We appreciate you sharing that with us. You may be thinking everything is okay when in reality you are as far from God as you've ever been. Now, understand, there were a lot of people in the Bible who strayed from God a long way and found their way back. And for some of us, that's your own personal journey that you have to navigate through, just like I have done. For example, one of the greatest examples of this is King David. David is an amazing story. In fact, I learned so much more about David as I was reading the chronology of David. I learned so much more about him and his family and everything that went around him by simply reading the Bible through chronologically. It's been a great adventure for me. Well, David was a man after God's own heart. He was a man who defeated a giant. He wrote the Psalms and proclaimed, "The Lord is my shepherd." Even though he properly could not discern his own spiritual condition. Because when he wrote that psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." One of the greatest psalms ever written. But did you know that David wrote that psalm while he was not close to God? Apparently, his own judgment of himself allowed him to stray. He just didn't know. And it took the prophet Nathan coming to him and telling him a story. "David, I got a story for you." He said, "There's a man in your kingdom. He's very poor. He only has one lamb. And he's next door neighbor to this guy who's got hundreds and thousands of sheep. And the owner of all those sheep was going to have a special guest in his home one day. And he went out and he took the poor man's sheep and made a meal out of it to serve his guest. David became bitterly angry and said, 'This man must die.' And Nathan said, 'You are the man. David, you had it all, and you wanted more. You had everything that you could ever imagine. You were faithful in the early years, but for some reason, you've now found yourself outside my will by committing adultery and then murder.' If you are here this morning and your conscience is clean, you know what I say to that? I don't care. Your conscience being clean has nothing to do with your faithfulness. So here's what I want you to take home with you today. If your conscience is clean, that may not mean a thing. It might mean a lot. It might mean, hey, I am faithful. But what I would suggest to you is don't trust what everyone else says. They all say, hey, you're a good person. Gary, you're one of the best people I know. People may say that about you. But what are you saying about yourself? Because none of it really matters. There's those around us who judge us, and there are those then inside ourselves that we judge. We may think everything is going great, but we need to be found and proven faithful. And there's only one judge of that, which leads us to the third area of judgment that we face, and it's found in verse 5. Let's look at verse 5. Verse 5 says, "Therefore, judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait until the Lord comes. He will bring to light what is hidden in darkness and will expose the motives of the heart. At that time, each will receive their praise from God." So we can be judged by others. We can judge ourselves. Those don't matter, but what does matter is being judged by God Himself. Now, there is coming a day when judgment is going to take place. In Matthew chapter 25, we are given several parables. I want to talk about two of them. There are two parables there, and one is the parable about the sheep and the goats. It says that when the Lord returns, He's going to put the sheep on His right, the goats on His left. Do you know what the difference was between the sheep and the goats? The sheep were found faithful. Wait a minute. But what were they found faithful doing? Jesus tells us. in that passage, Matthew 25, in that passage, he tells us what made them faithful. So wouldn't you kind of like to know what those sheep did to be found faithful? I know I would. If I want to be found faithful, then that's a great pattern. Feed the hungry, give water to the thirsty, clothe those who have no clothes, visit those in prison. For when you do it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me. A great passage. The other passage is the parable of the talents. So, as a servant, we must serve others. That's what the sheep and the goats teach us. But the parable of the talents, or the bags of gold, whatever you want to call this parable, it talks about responsibility. And it's a neat story. The master of the household is going to leave, so he gives 5 bags of gold, 5 talents of gold, we'll call it, 5 bags of gold, 5 talents, to one of his servants. He gives 2 to another, or 3 to another, and then 1 or 2 to the third one. And when he returns, the first one says, hey, you gave me 5 bags, I now have 10. The second one says, hey, you gave me 3, I got now 6. And the guy that had the 1 or the 2, and sorry, my memory's gone here, he says, I knew that you were a man to be feared, and so I didn't want to risk it. I didn't want to risk losing your money, so I just buried it in the ground. And you know what the master said? Away from me. You should have at least put it in the bank so it could have earned some interest. But you decided to do nothing. No risk. You see, being a Christian sometimes requires us to take risk. And folks, I'm going to tell you something. If we are in the last days and those days come in our lifetime, you will be required to show your faith more than you ever have before. That's why it'd be a good idea to kind of strengthen it now. Because we don't know when that's going to happen. It can happen at any minute. So that's what matters. When we stand before God and He judges us, will He say, well done, my good and faithful servant? Or will He say, depart from me, you workers of iniquity, into eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels? Doesn't really matter what you think. Because if going to heaven was based on what you think, every single person alive would go to heaven. Doesn't really matter what others think, because they just see that, maybe that facade that you put out so that people can see it. What really matters is, what are you like when you're alone with God and speaking with Him? And if you're not doing that, why aren't you? Because that's how we find ourselves and prove ourselves faithful. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, the challenge today is very, very clear. I pray that we would take this word, let it ring true in our ears, let it ring true in our hearts, and Father, show us how we can be made found faithful. Your word is so full of ways that we can know. Help us to get into your word, study it, to rightly divide it, that we may be proven to be a workman approved, rightly dividing the word of truth. And Father, when we realize that we have drawn closer to you, it might be a time for us to say that, yeah, we have accomplished what you've asked us to do. Forgive us of the times that we fail you, for those times are many. For it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.